Sometimes, real-life events are so strange and unbelievable, they make even the wildest spy thrillers seem tame by comparison. One of the most astonishing of these true stories is a top-secret American operation to recover a sunken Soviet submarine carrying nuclear weapons. Hey there, everyone! If you're the kind of person who loves a mysterious and thrilling story, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Welcome to our channel! We've got a truly fascinating tale coming your way right now. How the submarine vanished. The 1960s were the peak of the Cold War, a time when tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were more explosive than ever. It was, without a doubt, the most dangerous period humanity had faced since the invention of the atomic bomb, when the very survival of civilization hung by a thread. The whole chain of events began with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. In a top-secret mission known as Operation Anadir, the Soviet Union secretly shipped around 40 nuclear missiles to the revolutionary state of Cuba, just off the coast of the United States. The world teetered on the edge of disaster, just one misstep away from the outbreak of World War III. At the very last moment, sheer logic and the instinct for survival barely managed to win out. To protect the fleet carrying those nuclear missiles, Soviet submarines also took part in the operation and played a major role. And terrifyingly enough, those submarines weren't just carrying regular torpedoes, they were armed with torpedoes fitted with nuclear warheads. Thankfully, when the US Navy forced the Soviet submarines B-130, B-36, and B-59 to the surface in 1962, they had no idea those vessels were actually carrying nuclear torpedoes. However, the Pentagon was well aware that another Soviet submarine, the K-129, was outfitted with 3 R-21 ballistic missiles, each tipped with a nuclear warhead, along with 2 nuclear torpedoes. The K-129 officially entered active service in 1960. At first, it was assigned to the 123rd Brigade, and later became part of the 29th Submarine Division of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, operating out of Krasheninnikov Bay on the Kamchatka Peninsula. In truth, the crew of the K-129 was plagued by terrible luck. On February 26, 1968, when another submarine broke down and couldn't deploy, the K-129 was sent out on a combat mission from Avacha Bay in Kamchatka to take its place. At that time, the K-129 had just completed a month-and-a-half-long overhaul and was in excellent working condition. The officers in charge of the mission were seasoned professionals with years of experience under their belts. Once the voyage was complete, the current captain was set to be promoted to division commander, while the executive officer would step up to take over as the new captain. However, the regular enlisted crew had recently changed. Most of the older sailors who were about to leave the service had been replaced by young recruits pulled in from other subs. Altogether, there were 98 men aboard the submarine. Their mission was to travel along the 162nd meridian of the North Pacific, then turn east around latitude 40 degrees north. At its core, the goal of the mission was to get as close as possible to the US mainland in the event of war and launch a missile strike. Back then, missiles didn't have the kind of range we take for granted today, so closing the distance to the target was absolutely critical. And the single most important factor for success was staying hidden. That's why radio transmissions were kept to the absolute minimum necessary. On February 26th, the submarine sent a status update reporting that everything was proceeding as planned. The next scheduled communication was set for March 8th. But that day came and went, and after that, not a single message ever came from the K-129 again. It wasn't until a full week later that a search effort finally began. Depending on the source, the search continued anywhere from 72 days to as long as 6 months. Of course, trying to locate a sunken submarine in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean was like searching for a needle in a mountain of hay. It was an almost impossible task. In the end, the operation came up empty-handed. The submarine was officially declared lost, and its entire crew was presumed dead. But because the official statement used the word presumed, the families of the crew members were denied lifelong pensions and instead received a one-time payment equal to just 2 months' wages. That, sadly, was how the Soviet system handled things. How did the United States find the Soviet submarine? The disappearance of the Soviet submarine in the Pacific Ocean was picked up almost instantly by the very country it had been targeting, America. The US launched its own search operation nearly simultaneously with the Soviet Navy. And thanks to American intelligence agencies, the missing Soviet submarine was located surprisingly quickly. In fact, the US military had already pinpointed the general coordinates of the sub sinking by March 7, 1968, the day before it was supposed to report in. That critical information came from an underwater surveillance system the US had installed along the Pacific coast back in the 1950s, known as SOSUS. SOSUS was a specialized detection network that used a vast array of underwater microphones to constantly monitor and capture sounds beneath the sea. On that very day, March 7th, one part of the SOSUS system picked up an unusual sound, something that resembled an explosion. 2 weeks later, the US noticed growing agitation within the Soviet fleet and began to suspect that something serious had gone wrong on the enemy's side. More than 30 Soviet ships were seen moving back and forth over a particular patch of ocean, in a pattern so obvious that it was impossible to miss. Sometimes military analysts can be pretty sharp with their deductions, can't they? Putting the pieces together, the US connected the strange explosion sound with the Soviet fleet's odd behavior and began to suspect a submarine explosion. As a result, the Pentagon managed to narrow down the likely location of the sunken sub with surprising precision. Once the Soviet search efforts came to an end, the US waited a bit longer and then launched its own operation in July 1968, 4 months later. This mission to locate the submarine was given the codename Sand Dollar. To carry out the operation, the US Navy deployed the submarine USS Halibut from the legendary Pearl Harbor base, the very place where America had been drawn into World War II. The Halibut was no ordinary sub. It was loaded to the brim with specialized gear like underwater cameras, sonar systems, and remote probes, making it a one-of-a-kind deep-sea recon vessel. That's why it wasn't surprising at all that when, after just a month of searching, the wreckage of the K-129 was successfully located. The sunken sub had come to rest nearly 3 miles beneath the surface, deep in the ocean's crushing black depths. A massive vertical gash ran between the conning tower, and the missile launch tubes were torn apart and shredded. The submarine had been split clean in two, likely from the impact of hitting the seafloor. Every piece of evidence pointed to a violent explosion having taken place. But even with all that damage, experts still couldn't agree on what exactly caused the blast. At the very least, there were 3 major theories. One theory suggested the explosion had been triggered by a failure in the submarine's engine system. Another proposed that a valve malfunction in the snorkel system caused the sub to dive far deeper than it was designed to. And the third theory? That the K-129 had collided with an American submarine. How did the United States manage to raise the K-129? Finding a sunken submarine is one thing, but lifting it off the ocean floor is an entirely different challenge on a whole other level. Still, the Pentagon didn't hesitate to give that very order to recover the wreck. And not just any wreck. This was a submarine belonging to a nuclear-armed adversary, and the entire operation had to be carried out in total secrecy. If they failed, it could have escalated into a full-blown international crisis. With the aftershocks of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis still lingering, this was yet another bold move that flew in the face of global diplomatic norms. Then again, the Soviet sub wasn't exactly heading towards the US coast to deliver Christmas presents either. But let's set that aside for now. Still, why go to such extreme lengths and spend so much money just to bring up a single sunken submarine? The US weighed the risks and rewards and concluded that the potential payoff was absolutely worth it. There was a real chance they could recover priceless intelligence, details about submarine design, the structure of nuclear missiles and torpedoes, encryption codes, and other classified materials. But in front of the US military stood a seemingly impossible task: one that pushed the boundaries of what technology could even achieve. The sub was lying nearly 3 miles beneath the surface, and it weighed somewhere around 3,000 tons. Just to put that in perspective, the legendary Titanic sank in 1912 to a depth of 12,500 feet, and it still hasn't been raised. The largest single piece ever recovered from the Titanic only weighs about 20 tons. Now compare that to 3,000 tons. And yet, in the end, it all came down to money. To give you a preview, experts estimate the entire K-129 recovery operation ended up costing around $800 million. By comparison, raising the Titanic today would reportedly cost between $4 and $5 billion. And so began the final chapter of this astonishing story, a top-secret mission called Project Azorian. The man in charge was CIA official John Parangosky. The operation was kept completely under wraps, and it took about 6 years to plan and prepare before it could even begin. Between 1971 and 1973, a specially designed ship called the Glomar Explorer was built, along with a submersible barge named HMB-1. To grip the submarine on the seafloor, engineers also created a massive mechanical claw, which they codenamed Clementine. To keep everything secret, the funding didn't come through military channels. It was funneled through eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes. Hughes claimed the ship was being used to mine manganese nodules from the ocean floor. Interestingly, when other companies caught wind of Hughes's activities, they started launching their own deep-sea mineral surveys. While it's tough to calculate the potential profits, scientists estimate there are roughly 400 billion tons of iron manganese nodules scattered across the ocean bed. Of course, in this case, the whole manganese operation was just a cover story. The most striking feature of the Glomar Explorer, the ship built specifically for this mission, was its massive internal hangar, which took up nearly a third of the vessel's entire structure. But even that hangar, measuring 200 feet long, 700 feet wide, and 65 feet deep, wasn't big enough to hold the entire Soviet sub, which stretched over 300 feet from end to end. So the Pentagon decided to focus only on recovering the most valuable parts of the wreck, the bow and the central section, where the most sensitive intel was likely located. According to the plan, the Glomar Explorer and the self-propelled dock would work together to approach the wreck site. Then the submersible barge would sink beneath the surface and enter the belly of the Glomar Explorer, into its internal hangar, poetically known as the Moon Pool. With the barge now docked inside, the Glomar Explorer maneuvered itself with pinpoint precision until it was positioned directly above the wreck of the submarine. Then, using nearly 3 miles of steel pipe, the massive claw known as Clementine was slowly lowered to the seafloor, where it reached out to grab hold of the sunken vessel. In the summer of 1974, 6 years after the disaster, Clementine began its slow descent toward the target, and the operation finally entered its most critical phase. A mission of this size and scale was impossible to keep hidden from the watchful eyes of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. Soviet ships and helicopters began to appear one after another, circling the American operation closely. At one point, a Soviet vessel came within just 160 feet of the Glomar Explorer, and the situation was hanging by a thread. But in the end, the operation went far more smoothly than expected, and even took a bizarre and unexpected turn. According to a famous anecdote, after concluding that the Americans weren't up to anything suspicious, a line of Soviet sailors stood on their deck, turned their backs to the US ship, and dropped their pants as a mocking gesture. Not to be outdone, the Americans responded in kind, mooning them right back in perfect unison. And just like that, a potential powder keg of international conflict ended in the most ridiculous and comical way imaginable. All the while, far below that tension on the surface, Clementine's claw had firmly latched onto the wreck, more than 16,000 feet down in the deep. The slow and careful lift began, but partway through, one of the claw's arms broke. Most of the submarine, devastatingly, slipped free and tumbled back down into the abyss. In the end, the only portion that made it into the Glomar Explorer's moon pool was a section of the hull roughly 40 feet long. Still, the US considered the operation a success. It was officially declared a victory, and the ship began its journey home. According to a few scraps of information that leaked to the ever-curious American press, the CIA and Pentagon recovered 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes and some fragments of documents, including photo film of the crew. With a total estimated cost of around $800 million, it became one of the most expensive and challenging covert missions in history. One U.S. Navy admiral even said, "The difficulty of Project Azorian was on par with landing on the moon." But there was a tragic side to the mission. During the recovery, the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors were discovered. To the United States' credit, on September 4, 1974, the men were given a proper burial at sea in accordance with naval traditions. Their remains were respectfully wrapped in the Soviet naval flag, and the Soviet national anthem was played during the ceremony. Parts of the operation began to leak in 1975, but it wasn't until October 1992, 25 years later, that its existence was officially acknowledged. At that time, CIA Director Robert Gates formally handed over video footage of the burial to Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Touched by this act of goodwill, the newly formed Russian government finally confirmed the sinking of K-129. In 1998, on the 30th anniversary of the accident, the crew members of the K-129 were posthumously awarded the Order of Courage. That same year, the families of the fallen sailors were invited to the crash site in the Pacific, where they laid flowers over the ocean that had swallowed all 98 crew members 3 decades earlier. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and share it on social media. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll see you again next time. Take care.